Thanks, Robin. I always feel like preaching after baptisms. I'm like, everyone's ready to go home now. Like, that was awesome. The party's over, and now you're going to get up and talk. And not only that, it's like the one day we have all the kids in the room is the day the kids all had chocolate for breakfast. How do you think this is going to go? But kids, I'm stoked that you're in here today, and I won't be as long as I normally am, I promise. My name's Mark, if we haven't met yet, and happy Easter. I'm one of the pastors here, and if we're just meeting for the first time, you definitely won't know what I'm about to share with you. But even if you've been a part of this church for as long as I've been here, you may not know what I'm about to share with you, and that's the simple fact that I'm actually, if you get to know me, quite a skeptical person. Like, actually probably really skeptical once you get to know me about pretty much everything in the world. And when I think back, I remember distinctly as a child not being skeptical. In fact, being the opposite of skeptical, being incredibly trusting. I don't really know when the unraveling began to happen, but I have this memory in my head when this letter came in the mail. This is before the internet, and this letter was all colorful, and it's like, "You've won $1 million." And I was like, "Dad, we won free money." And my dad, in his thick French-Canadian accent, was like, "Marc, nothing's free in this world." And I'm like, what happened to you, man? Like, why are you so miserable? And so I was just so excited. I'm like, it just says we just have to reply once, and then we get the check. And we replied once, replied twice, and 3 and 4, and clearly I'm not a millionaire. And clearly I became a little more skeptical that week, right? And then the skepticism just continued to grow. I got a little bit older as a kid, and then things would happen like, the knock on your door. Remember the vest and clipboard people that would come to your door? They'd have the construction boots on. They're like, "Hey, sir, do you want me to leave my boots outside or inside as I come to check your furnace?" And as you're trying to figure out, like, why do I care where you leave your boots? They're already like, "No worry, I'll leave them outside." And you're still like, why am I? And now they're in your basement. They're looking at your furnace. Your parents are like, "Why is there a strange person in our house with a clipboard and trying to sell us?" And I'm like, I don't know. I was just trying to figure out where to put his boots, right? Then there was maybe that time where I was a bit older. I got a call from the vendor from the wedding fair, and they're like, "Hey, congratulations, you got a free honeymoon." I'm like, "Sweetheart, we got a free honeymoon. We just have to go claim it at this hotel." And then we're in this dingy hotel basement learning a presentation about pots and pans, and I'm like, where's my free vacation? This isn't what I came here for. Right? Or then it was that trip to Europe, and I remember it so distinctly, a big crowd of people, downtown Rome, and all of a sudden this young woman screaming as she's being attacked by this young man, and I go into like Liam Neeson mode, and I'm like, I'm gonna rescue her. And then, a moment later, I'm chasing her down this dark tunnel, and then I realize I'm surrounded by a bunch of men, and I realize she's not in danger, I'm in danger. And I'm clearly the only person who didn't read the guidebook about all the scams that this city has to offer. Thankfully, I can run quickly. Do you see why I'm skeptical? Like, now I'm just skeptical. I see an asterisk on a sign. I don't even read the fine print. I'm like, nope, not interested. I see an unknown caller on my caller ID, and I just think, nope, not gonna try it. And people are like, but what if it's like your wife and her phone's dead and she has a flat tire and it's a Good Samaritan's phone? And I'm like, I hope a Good Samaritan can change a tire because I'm not picking up, right? Like, I hear an unexpected knock on the door, and I'm just like, right? Like, I just don't trust people. I'm super skeptical. Now my kids are like, Dad, quick, just give me your fingerprint so I get this free game on my iPad. And I'm like, nothing's free in this world. And then I'm like, no, it's happened. I'm that dad. And it might be, what you might call a career-limiting move to confess that to your church when you're the pastor, that you're incredibly skeptical. But it also means that I understand the reality of the world. Like, I'm under no illusions of how the rest of the world views me and my profession. Like, I meet someone, and there's about 7 seconds before things get real awkward, right? I'm like, "Hey, what's your name?" And then they ask me what my name is. Then they say, "What do you do for a living?" And then I say, "I'm a pastor." And then they look at me like, do I need to tell you that storks don't deliver babies, right? Like, you believe in God, right? Like, and then it's just strange, awkward, or silent, or the conversation ends, right? Like, I'm under no illusions that when people meet me, they're like, you are like an asterisk. You are like an unexpected doorbell, right? Or unexpected call, right? Like, I get that because I'm super skeptical too. And maybe you're here today and you're feeling that same thing. Maybe you're here, you're like, I'm not a church person, I'm not a Christian. This is the time where I just come with family, or I've been coming with my family for years, but like, I don't really get it. Like, I'm in a room full of people who are singing to a person who was killed and they think somehow mysteriously or magically rose from the grave, and you're super skeptical about that. And the truth is, you're not alone in that. You know, while you're in a room full of people who believe that 2,000 years ago, God wrote himself into human history in the person of Jesus, lived this incredible life, and then was crucified, and then 3 days later rose from the grave, you're not alone in your skepticism. You're not as much of an outlier as you think you are, because this Sunday, 2,000 years ago, there were exactly 0 Jesus followers. Everybody was skeptical the first Easter. There was nobody outside the tomb, you know, that first Easter Sunday morning thinking, here he comes, here he's coming, 5, 4, count it with me, 3, come on, Jesus, right? Like, nobody was there. Everyone was like hiding, crying. The women show up not with balloons, but with burial spices to care for what? Not a resurrected body, a dead body. They wanted to take care of a dead body. When Mary finds the tomb open, she doesn't kind of smirk and think, ooh, it's happening. Jesus, where are you hiding, right? Like, no. She's like, someone stole the body. That's all she can think, someone stole the body. That's the only conclusion. She goes to tell the men what's going on. Where are they? They don't have like the door half, cracked open accidentally, and they're not hiding behind the furniture, ready to jump out and be like, surprise, Jesus, we knew you could do it. Nope, they're hiding locked doors like they killed our leader, now they're gonna kill us next, right? Like they have no hope in humanity left. They are skeptical. Everyone is skeptical that first Easter morning. And why wouldn't they be? Jesus was arrested, put on trial, crucified by professional executioners, Roman guards whose lives would have stood to be taken if their job was not finished right, if they didn't execute properly. 9-inch nails secured their victims to the tree, beaten to the point of death. There were 0 believers that first Easter morning. Everyone was a skeptic. And as a skeptic, it's the details in this story, the details that come next, that actually cause me to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. For so many people, I get it. Easter's a nice story. It's a nice fable. It's a lesson about new life or second chances. But at its core, it's a fairy tale. That's some people. For others, it's nothing more than cult creation 101, right? Get people to think that your leader has superhuman powers. You know, what better way and what better story than a leader who was killed by the empire and then conquered death? That story will sell. Spread that story long enough and eventually people will believe that legend. But when you read the original accounts, everything is wrong with that narrative. The original accounts don't read like those of a person who's creating history. It's all wrong. And for me as a skeptic, the history of it all doesn't add up to make me believe that. First off, when you read the Christians' own accounts in their own words in the scriptures, they get it wrong if they're trying to get people to trust their story. First of all, there's the first witnesses to the empty grave. They're women. In the ancient Near East, women weren't trusted. They couldn't give testimony in court. If you're trying to make up a religion and get people to buy your story in the ancient Near East, you don't use women as your first witnesses of the resurrection. Nobody would believe it. The second part is that if these people are trying to create this cult or create this religion and to be the leaders of it, they don't do a very good job selling themselves as trustworthy the leaders of it. Because the authors of the New Testament, many of them disciples of Jesus themselves, don't write themselves in a very good light. They record their own cowardice, their doubt, their lack of faith. They write what many assume to be the truth, because if you're making it up, you write yourself in a better light. But they record their own stupidity, cowardice, ignorance, the fact that they even doubted the resurrection, the fact that they abandoned Jesus in the time of need, they abandoned their best friend, and they record all of those details. They even record that one of them was so scared when the Roman guards grabbed them by the cloak, they decided, I'd rather run away naked than be caught with Jesus. And they record that. None of the gospel writers paint themselves in a good light. Not a good start to making up a story and trying to build your credibility to be the leaders of it. But let's say they thought of that. Let's say they added these negative details in to throw the scent off. Well, then there's the problem of timing. Because historians and sociologists have actually nailed down the recipe for how to create a great legend that people believe. And step number 1 is wait till everyone who was an eyewitness is dead. That way, people can't say, hang on, I was there. That's not how it went. If you start a legend too soon, people can fact check it, right? Like imagine if tomorrow I told people, we had a great Easter service, 2 baptisms, and then I just flew around the room. I just floated all around, right? Like everyone be like, yeah, we were there. That didn't happen, right? Because you're eyewitnesses and you're still alive. I got to wait till you're all dead before I make up that story. If that's the case, not that I'm going to outlive all you. Anyways. If that's the case, the historical accounts record that Jesus' movement started way too early to dupe people. It grew while eyewitnesses were still alive. With this story, within one generation, there's 4 different written accounts of Jesus' life, documented alongside historical places and events and rulers. One of the accounts of Jesus' life even says after he rose, he showed himself to 500 people. And the author says this, some of them are still alive to this day, basically saying, go ahead, fact check me. Now, not only is the timing of these recorded accounts problematic for those assuming it's a legend written after everyone was dead, but the sheer amount of literature devoted to a dead carpenter 2,000 years ago, written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, it just bears like, how do you explain that? The amount of literature would be groundbreaking even for royalty. Think of Alexander the Great. We've all heard of him. Majority of everything we know about him comes from one source, Livy. And when was it written? 400 years after his life. And Jesus, a carpenter from the region of Judea, some backwater town, somehow has 4 accounts written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses who could have disputed the accounts. And instead, this movement grew in the time when the eyewitnesses were still alive. The skeptic in me can't ignore that either. Those facts make me skeptical of the birth legend theories. It feels a lot more like a historically based movement, responding to something that happened that the eyewitnesses corroborated. But then as a skeptic, I still have more things to be skeptical about. I look at the details and I think, yeah, but history tells us, that we shouldn't forget that the winners often get a hand in writing the history books because winners get to document what happened. I'm reminded of that scene from the movie 300 when the messenger says to Gerard Butler's character, we will erase your memory from the history books. Nobody will ever know that you existed. Bottom line, he was saying the winners write the history books and they can tweak as they wish. And there's no denying that. But again, my skeptical side reminds me that in the first few hundred years after the death of Jesus, Christians weren't the winners. They were the losers. They weren't writing the history books. To be Christian was synonymous with having a death wish. This was the time of the Roman Empire, Nero's Rome. Now, our kids are in the room, so I won't describe how Rome treated the Christians in detail, but you can go home and Google what happened to the Christians in the first century in Rome. Google Nero's circus specifically. And as you read how Christians were treated, you tell me if you think the winners, that they are the winners with enough power to rewrite history. They weren't the winners rewriting history. The winners, the Romans, were writing about the Christians. One example of this writing was during the Great Roman Plagues. It's a well-known fact. The Romans suffered plague after plague after plague. The best estimate is 25 to 30% of Romans died in that time. And it's also well known that the Romans were so fearful of death and the plagues that they would throw their sick loved ones out into the streets because they feared death so much. And we have letters written by the Roman Emperor Julian documenting the fact that the Christians would go out into the streets, caring not only for their own sick, but for the Romans as well. The Roman emperor is actually complaining in a letter that we still have to this day. He says, they should be wanting our aid, but it's the Christians who offer it. And there's so many other accounts like this. The Romans, those in power, the winners, record in their history books a movement of people who believed their leader had been killed and believed that that leader had risen. And they recorded the behavior of these people, how these people didn't fear death, how they chose to love their neighbor, even if it cost them their life. This is in the Roman history books. I love how one historian asked, how do you explain the Christian faith breaking out of the first century? There was no status, privilege, or benefit to believing in Jesus or following Jesus in the first century, and yet the movement exploded. The historically honest question is not, did the resurrection happen? It's a fair question. But the more challenging one for me as a skeptic is, if the resurrection didn't happen, how do I explain a bunch of first century people choosing to live in a way that often cost them their life based on a belief that a carpenter from a backwater town rose from the grave within a verifiable time period? I'm convinced for the early Jesus followers, it took more faith to deny the resurrection than to believe it, even if it cost them something, even if it cost them their lives. As a skeptic, I can't ignore this part of history. The resurrection actually happening is the best explanation I have for how the Jesus movement exploded out of the first century. The skeptic in me feels if claiming the resurrection is a legend, history verifies the writers started too early. The skeptic in me can't ignore that. If claiming the leveraging of power to rewrite the history books, history lacks any evidence of that influence or power, and the skeptic in me can't ignore that. If pointing to status or privilege or benefits as an explanation as to why someone joined the Jesus movement and why the Jesus movement exploded, the evidence of mass murder, mistreatment of Christians, and slander for hundreds of years of the Christian movement needs to be strategically ignored. And as a skeptic, I can't do that. As a skeptic, I'd be skeptical of ignoring all those facts. The bottom line is, for me personally, I don't believe in the resurrection because a book tells me it happened. I'd be skeptical of that. No, I believe in the resurrection because after looking at all the historical evidence, I'm convinced not believing in it requires a lot more faith. So that's why I believe the resurrection happened. That's why I follow Jesus. That's why I believe in God. But then there's the question of, why is it good news? Why is it worth celebrating? Or why is it worth reorienting our entire lives around, as those in the baptism tank have just done? Because 2,000 years ago and today, it wasn't just factual. It wasn't just news. It was good news. Because if a carpenter 2,000 years ago predicted his own death and resurrection and then pulled it off, then I'm going to dare to say he was right about the things that he was saying. It means that when he says, if you have seen me, you have seen God, he was saying, I am God. I am exactly what God is like. My personality, my characteristics, my posture, my kindness, exactly what God is like. Now that's good news for us today, but back then that would have been mind-blowing. Remember, this isn't a time 2,000 years ago of far-off deities, ones who expected child sacrifices to appease their anger, who threatened to stir the ocean and drown the sailors if they weren't pleased. Think about that. In a world where the gods were seen as on the side of the wealthy, the privileged, and the powerful, this God loved everyone, the marginalized especially. In a time where the gods were seen as slave masters and humans as the slaves, Jesus, being God, flies in the face of all that. It meant the creator of the world is not just some tyrant up in the clouds, wielding lightning bolts to instill fear in its subjects. It meant God was exactly like Jesus, perfect love, because Jesus is God. It means that God is like a caring parent and that God would do anything for God's children, even to the point of death, even death on a cross, just to be in relationship with us. Instead of demanding blood, this God would give this God's own blood for us. If Jesus rose, if Jesus actually was God and not just another charismatic human who could draw a crowd, it meant God was perfect love. And that means what Jesus said about humans was true as well, that we are made in the image of God, that we are worthy of love, that we can have second and third and 77th chances. As he described it to one person, we could be born again. We could have new life. It didn't matter what we've done, who we've slept with, what regime we've worked for, who we've exploited or been exploited by, how unforgivable our behaviors seem. There is nothing we can do, nowhere we can go that removes us from God's love. If Jesus is God and Jesus rose, that means the way of Jesus, the way of love, wins. And it means that the way of power and control and empire doesn't. It means that we can dare to serve and sacrifice, even when it will cost us dearly, even when it costs our lives, knowing no matter how hopeless a situation can be, even if it leads to death, we follow a resurrected Savior, a God who conquers death and is in the business of bringing dead things to life. The early Christians experienced this, believed this, and lived in light of this hope that the resurrection gave them. It's why they could do the right thing and even care for their oppressive Roman neighbors, because they had hope. They didn't fear death. They knew the way of love wins. On that first Easter Sunday, Jesus conquered the grave and showed them and showed us that death is not the end. We can live life to the full, now and forever, in relationship with a God who looks exactly like Jesus. A God who would rather die for his enemies than ever raise a hand against them. That is good news, not just for the winners and the powerful in history, not just for the wealthy, for everyone. And that hope is found in no other name than that of Jesus. That's good news that even a skeptic like me can get behind. Jesus is exactly like God. Jesus is God. Jesus is what God is like. Jesus died on a Roman cross, and today, 2,000 years ago, Jesus rose from the grave. That is what we celebrate today. If you're just joining us for the first time, this is who we are all about here at Lakeside. For us, it's all about Jesus, who's a perfect representation of God, because Jesus is God. Every week we gather, we sing, and we learn about this Jesus, who we believe rose from the grave, who is perfect love, and we seek to grow in our relationship with this God. Whether you're skeptical like me, or curious, or unsure what you believe, I just want you to know you're welcome here. And starting next week, we're actually starting a brand new series where we're gonna take a few weeks and look at some of the biggest and hardest questions that people ask of the Christian faith. Questions like, if God is so loving, why is there so much suffering in the world? And that's a fantastic question. Or why does it often seem like God doesn't answer prayer? If you've ever wrestled with questions like that, I think you're really gonna love joining us starting next week. We're here every Sunday, 10 a.m., and also online on all the different channels. Before I send you off and bless you, just wanna remind you, whether you're part of our community or here for the first time, we have some prayer teams who will be up at the front at the crosses. Feel free to go. And if you want someone to pray with you for anything that you're going through, they would just be so delighted to pray for you. I just want to say thanks for joining us this Easter Sunday. Thanks for celebrating with us in baptism. And I want to bless you from a letter that was written to the Ephesians, a small group of Jesus followers in this first century. And this was an encouragement and blessing to them. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Friends, he rose on Resurrection Sunday, and we now get to live in response to that. Thanks for joining us. Have a great Sunday. Bye, friends.